Abby, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for a great turnout this morning, 300 and odd plus attendees, clerks and councillors alike. Thank you so much. It's really nice to have such a responsive audience. As you know, we're co-hosting today with our colleagues at NALC and Justin Griggs, who's our head of policy and communications at NALC, will actually take the lion's share of the work this morning. So thanks to you, Justin, for doing all of that. I also like to introduce to you Stephen Rolfe, who's head of community assets and enterprises at Locality, and he'll be speaking later, as will James Harrison, community ownership fund delivery team at DLUC. So thanks, gents, for joining us today. Thanks, Justin, for your help with laying this on. Just really briefly, the other guys will speak with more detail and knowledge about it, but the community ownership fund, £150 million fund over 4 years, so far only open to voluntary and community groups, and Shazam has only recently been opened up to town, parish and community councils. Many of you will be aware that, like our colleagues at NALC and SLCC, have been lobbying or bending the ear of anybody who will listen, specifically MPs, ministers and anyone else who will listen from the departments, about the need for our sector to get access to this funding, to make sure it gets to the hyperlocal level where we think it's needed most. So having made all that noise, we're delighted that they've been so responsive to allow us access to the money. What's really important now is that you actually access the money and deliver on what we've been saying we've wanted to do. So I just wanted to thank you for turning up, because it clearly demonstrates a kind of aspiration to get this money and to spend it. And please be aware, of course, that if you were thinking about perhaps a Public Works Loan Board application, you might want to switch tack and maybe look at this funding anyway. I won't go into the technicalities of it. The gentlemen are here to walk you through that. I just wanted to thank you all for attending, and the panel here for helping us out with this event. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Justin to get things going. Thanks, Justin.
Brilliant, and thanks, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Griggs. I'm Head of Policy and Communications at the National Association of Local Councils. I really want to echo much of what Rob has said, because now we're really pleased to have joined up with our colleagues at the Society of Local Council Clerks to deliver today's online event for councillors and clerks on the Community Ownership Fund. It really is great news that community, parish and town councils, the first tier of local government in England and Wales, can now apply to this important government fund for the first time. NALC has been a leading and strong voice for extending the fund to local councils with the support of others too, such as our colleagues in the Society of Local Council Clerks. And we're thrilled the government has listened, because we know that local councils have long been at the forefront, directly or with the community, of taking control of much loved local assets, from pubs to theatres to sports grounds, championing in individual cases and building wider local support. This vital funding, we know, will help councils continue to work with their communities to protect, to enhance and preserve their treasured community assets. And I sincerely hope all of you joining us for today's event, and indeed other councils not represented today that you know and they're in your networks, will consider applying and being at the forefront of taking up this direct funding opportunity, which NALC has successfully secured. So it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. James Harrison is from the Community Ownership Fund Delivery Team in the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And Stephen Rolfe is Head of Community Assets and Enterprise at the National Membership Network for Community Organisations, the Locality, which is delivering the fund's support programme on behalf of the government. Both will speak for up to 15 minutes. Yes, their presentations will be shared afterwards in the follow-up email to attendees. Then they'll respond to your questions. So as Abby has said, please use the Q&A function to put your questions to James and Stephen. Don't forget, you can upvote the questions that you really like. So we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can in the time we've got today. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. James and Stephen, thanks so much to both of you. James, you're first up. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Justin. Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, I'm James Harrison. I'm the policy lead for the Community Ownership Fund at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which has involved designing and changing and launching various rounds of the fund so far. And as mentioned, from round 3, local councils will be able to apply to the fund for the first time, which is a big change and something we're very excited about. I'm going to talk briefly about what the fund is for those of you who are coming to it new, talk about what we're looking to fund, and then briefly outline the way that we do assessment and the process that you'll need to go through to give you the headlines on that. If I can have the next slide, please, Abby. So the Community Ownership Fund is a £150 million UK-wide fund. We're looking to fund community assets in all areas, towns, rural areas, and different regions across the UK. Its fundamental purpose is to help community groups to protect assets in the local area which are at risk of being lost, and to protect them through community ownership. Groups can now bid for up to £1 million in matched funding. Most projects will be up to £250,000, but if groups can demonstrate the value for money of going above that and going up to 1 million for larger and more impactful projects, there is up to £1 million available. And as mentioned, from round 3, parish, town and community councils are now able to apply to the fund, essentially on the exact same terms as other community groups have been able to apply in rounds 1 and in round 2. Next slide, please. So we've been running the fund for a couple of years now, and we've funded 98 community projects so far, totaling close to £24 million. Interest in the fund has increased over that time, and in the window that we're about to announce, which is the end of round 2, we're going to have another tranche of funding which will increase the total amount of the pot spent. We've got £150 million, as I said, so there's a significant amount of money left for the final 2 years of the fund. So I would encourage you to look upon that opportunity and think about what bids you can get in the 2 years we have remaining. They've got a little breakdown there of the different regions or the different countries across the UK. And just to flag that we do fund all sorts of different asset types. So we've funded typically community centres, pubs, some sports clubs and some heritage buildings, but we've funded lots of other things as well. And there isn't a definitive list published on our prospectus. We don't limit you to a definitive list. It's essentially down to the local place to define what is a community asset for them and to make the case for why it matters to the community, you know, how it's accessible, how community engagement takes place in that area. So if you've got something interesting or most likely something you think is unique to your area, it's definitely something we'd be interested in having a look at. Have the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the application process. So you kind of start thinking about what would be involved in this, decide whether it would be right for you, and kind of think about what sort of information you would need to be getting together right from the outset. So the most important thing after this webinar, if you're interested, is to go away and read the prospectus on gov.uk. It's a fairly long document, but it outlines everything I'm covering in more detail, and it crucially includes all the eligibility criteria for the fund and kind of explains what those mean in a few paragraphs for each one, and covers off kind of some of the really key things like the match funding requirements and the types of eligible organisation and the kind of skills that you would need to demonstrate when you come to putting in your application. So definitely give it a good read through before you go any further. If you decide that you are going to submit to the fund, you'll need to do an expression of interest form first, which is a short form. It's only a few questions, and it's essentially to gauge whether your project is likely to be eligible for the fund. And I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail in a minute in terms of the feedback you get from that. Really importantly, Stephen will talk in a bit about the advice and the more tailored materials available from the delivery support provider on the fund, which will be incredibly helpful for you in putting in an application. And if you get through the expression of interest phase, we will invite you to submit a full application. We open these windows 4 times a year in which you can submit your main application. So they're pretty frequent, and hopefully they'll fall at a time that's quite appropriate for you, especially if you're trying to save an asset that's kind of at imminent risk of loss, or where you need to move relatively quickly to save it. And then of course we'll give you an outcome of your application, and if you've been successful, we will enter into a legal agreement with you to provide the funding. Move on, please. So the EOI stage, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail because this is the first kind of formal stage you will encounter if you're applying to the fund. As I said, it's a brief form to test the eligibility of your organisation and project and to gather some basic information about the project, such as a short description of it. When we come back to you following the EOI, we will give you one of 3 outcomes. One might be that we say that you're not eligible to apply for the Community Ownership Fund. It's kind of fundamentally not the right funding source for you, and that allows you to stop there and not waste any more time essentially putting together a long application, and we'll explain why that's the case. In many cases, the second outcome is more likely, which is where we say we think you could apply to the fund, but there's some things we want you to think about in more detail, or some areas that you need to be careful of or clarify when you put your main application in. And then again, you can go and check in the prospectus and make sure you've definitely met the eligibility criteria on those specific points. Or we might tell you that we think sounds like a great project and we think you are highly likely to be eligible for the fund, and therefore we'd like you to go ahead and put in a main application. And you'll get sent a link, as I said. If the main bidding window is open at that point, we will send you that link straight off. And if not, we will we'll send you the link as soon as the main bidding window opens for the next one. Thanks. Next slide. We made some other changes in round 3, aside from the inclusion of local councils, which I've mentioned, which are worth being aware of, especially if you had looked at the prospectus before and maybe seen an older version. One of the key ones is that we've reduced the match funding required to apply to the fund. Previously, we required match funding on a 50-50 basis. So for every £1 of government funding you wanted, you would need to raise £1 yourselves. That's now on a 80-20 basis. So if your project was £100,000, we could give you 80,000 and you would need to raise 20. So it's a much more accessible match funding level in terms of the amount of extra funding you need to raise. We've extended the cap up to £1 million for all asset types. As I mentioned previously, this was only open to sports and leisure projects. And we've also significantly changed the application form, the prospectus and the guidance for applicants. And of course, this is complemented by the guidance provided by Locality and the delivery support provider. Next slide, please. So in terms of the full application, the assessment criteria guidance, which is linked in the prospectus, tells you essentially the mark scheme that we use for assessing your application. So alongside the prospectus, you should check out the assessment criteria guidance, as that will tell you what we're looking for in a strong answer. You'll be asked to outline essentially 2 cases for why you should receive funding. The first is the strategic case, which outlines the risk facing the asset and why there is a need for government intervention with the funding. And the second one is the management case, which is all your financials and your business plan. You will need to submit some documents as you go along. There's not a huge number of documents to submit, but we need to see some evidence of certain things. If you're buying an asset, for example, we'll need to see a valuation of that asset. We'll ask you to provide some evidence of community engagement to show that your plan has wide community buy-in, and we'll also ask to see a business plan, which is the most involved document and includes kind of all your costings and cash flow forecasts and that kind of thing, so we can be sure the asset will be run sustainably. If we move on, please. Thank you. So the strategic case in more detail, these are kind of the main areas that we'll assess within the strategic case. You don't need to make a note now. As I say, we'll send the slides around, and also it's published on the prospectus. But we need to see what risk your asset is facing. So this fund, to be really clear, is for assets which are at risk of being lost or have already been lost. For example, they've closed down or become derelict. It's not a fund that will help assets which are currently being run well, but could be improved in some way. You know, if they had a bit more money. It's for those assets which are likely to be lost for some reason or have already been lost. We're really keen to see evidence of wider community support. So great if you've got a kind of core group of people or the core group on the council who are backing this, but we want to see how you've engaged with others and reached out right across your community to different groups. Likewise, we want to see what partnerships you've built with other local organisations and maybe other tiers of government, if relevant. We want to see what benefits your asset will bring to the community, and the more specific you can be about the benefits, the better, in terms of we expect to help this many people, or we expect to see these outcomes over a number of years. And finally, we will assess your impact on environmental sustainability, for example, in the way that you're restoring the building or in terms of education that the building might provide. You can interpret that one in a number of different ways. We'll go on to the next slide, which is the management case. Again, this is really important, and actually I can tell you this is the area that most unsuccessful projects fall down on, is having a really robust and informed management case that kind of shows those commercial skills required to run your assets. So is the project overall financially viable, and do you have a sustainable business plan? That's really the most important thing we're looking for, and we want to see you demonstrating that with realistic income forecasts, realistic expenditure, building in some leeway for things like inflation pressures or contingency funding that you might require. So making some sensible estimates there and letting us know how you've arrived at them. We also want to know that you've got the skills and the governance in place to manage the project properly, so there aren't any kind of risks in terms of it being very light touch governance, or you're not relying on kind of one director or one trustee to run the whole project, and also that the people who are involved in the management team of the project have the appropriate skills to do it, and that will include some commercial skills. We also want to know that the setup of the organisation is accountable to the local community, which I think should be easier for parish councils to demonstrate maybe than some community projects have found in the past. And essentially, we just want to make sure that you've provided clear financial information throughout and kind of backed up various cost estimates and so on with as much detail as you can. Let's go to the next slide, please, which is just a recap of the key information. So as I've mentioned several times, we've got a prospectus online. Can't emphasize enough that it's important to read this through, and the application form assessment criteria guidance, which, as I mentioned, is the sort of mark scheme of what we'll be looking at. So that's the other one to really pay close attention to. And I would suggest reading that one through before you start your application to get an idea of the sort of evidence you need to gather, and definitely read it through again before you submit to make sure that you've hit all those key points. We do currently have a bidding window open, which opened in May and will close at the beginning of July. And then we will be opening another one in August, and as I said, 2 more in the financial year following. So we will frequently have open bidding windows. I think that's the end of my presentation, so I'm going to hand back to Justin.
Fantastic. And thank you, James. And also just to echo, I think we're not just welcomed the extension of the fund to community, parish and town council, but some of the other changes that were introduced, I think have been very widely welcomed across not just the local council world, but also across communities as well. With no further ado, I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm Stephen Rolfe from Locality, and just as a bit of background, in case you don't know who Locality is, we're a national organisation who believes in the power of community to transform lives and create a fairer society. We do that by providing specialist advice, peer learning, resources, and campaign and policy work to ensure that every community thrives and local organisations are able to unlock the power that exists in every place. Being a membership organisation, that's at the heart of what we want to achieve, and currently there's 1,600 similar community-based organisations working around England, which are Locality members, and we're always looking for new interests. So please check that out. Coming up soon, we have our annual convention. It's the largest of its kind in the sector. This year it's in Bristol. Tickets on sale now, and COF will feature heavily throughout the packed agenda. So keep your eye out on that, especially if you're particularly local to the Bristol area. You may know us as a parish council through neighbourhood planning, perhaps. We're the delivery partner for neighbourhood planning for government, and have worked on a number of related community-led housing programmes. So parish councils that have accessed grant through neighbourhood planning, again, may want to look to community ownership fund as a kind of perfect exit vehicle for some of that strategic work. If there's some particular asset projects that are appearing at the moment through neighbourhood planning exercises, then there's an interesting link there that you might want to think about. And yes, we're the lead organisation for the support side of the fund. Next slide, please. I think you can move that one on. Thanks. And that one, because James has covered some of these aspects. And that one. Great. What's available from us currently in this round? No, sorry, you'll need to move that one on as well. That's a recap of what James has already outlined. Okay, so we are part of a consortium of partners across the UK. As the logos there of the organisations around which are also involved in this with us. In Wales, that's the Development Trust Wales and Compass, Development Trust Northern Ireland and Development Trust Association in Scotland, and then in England, Plunkett, Co-ops UK, Shared Assets, Sporting Assets and the Architectural Heritage Fund. These are a collection of organisations which have specialisms and particular interests and experience around topics, but also providing generalist support. So whilst there will be coordination in the devolved nations and regions, that we will be working across the UK in tandem. And if you are able to come through the system and draw down some support from us, you could well end up working with any of the particular organisations here. Next slide, please. The support that we're providing kind of works in 3 layers. It's kind of three prongs. Anybody can access the resources and guidance, including webinars and related material through My Community. Then at the next level down, there's more detail available and assistance for individual applicants, potential applicants. We have a manned advice service, which we are, it's been open now for a couple of months and has been very busy, and things around eligibility, what makes a good application, etc., can be sent into our advice service. And again, it's UK-wide coverage, so it doesn't matter where you're based or what you're particularly interested in. It's a central service focused on helping people make a good application or expression of interest to the fund. And then the third layer, which is more detailed and will be available to a smaller group of potential groups, is the in-depth support packages. Next slide, please. In terms of the in-depth support, what could it look like? It will be very much dictated on what the group is interested in. It's a bespoke arrangement, although there is a menu of potential areas of support which could be offered. It's very much one-to-one in terms of advice and coaching, heavily angled towards making a good, strong proposition to the main fund. So a lot of emphasis on the business case, the governance side of things, financial planning, forecasting into the and governance and related aspects like that. Alongside as well is the opportunity to apply for a small revenue grant to secure some external special advice, perhaps professional fees, an architect, surveyor, perhaps, to beef up your particular application, to get it into a state where it would make a strong argument to the main fund. Those small revenue grants would be in the region of £10,000. That's what we're expecting. They're about to open soon for applicants for in-depth support. It's important to stress that not all groups that are eligible for the fund will necessarily be able to draw down in-depth support from us. It will be prioritised. The prioritisation process internally is chiefly based on geographic location. So there's a combination assessment of indices of multiple deprivation, where organisations rank on the Community Needs Index, and demographics as well. So the in-depth support is particularly angled to more disadvantaged communities and more disadvantaged places. But that prioritisation process as well is explained in more detail on DLUC's website, if you want to go into it in more detail. Next slide, please. There's lots of material and external resource going up on the My Community website all the time. We've had a series of webinars which have focused on specific aspects which we've picked up that are really important to make a good application, particularly around the management case and thinking about the business plan and the financial side of things. They're available as historic documents and anybody can kind of listen to those again. But coming up, just for your information, this month, there's some more topic focused stuff around heritage assets. That's tomorrow, in fact. And then later on in June on the 20th, there's a focus session around sporting assets and sports clubs and related topics like that. We've also had lots of requests around match funding, so we know that's interesting. Although it's welcome that the match requirement has reduced, that's obviously still a piece of work to pull together match. And coming up in July on the 10th, we'll have a specific session around community shares and how that can be used as match funding, and then later on a more generic discussion and resourcing and signposting about that topic, which parish councils naturally are welcome to join, and as well as community organisations on your particular patch. We've also produced a Word document version of the application form, again listening to potential applicants and inquirers over the last month or so, having a kind of full document which you can kind of work on offline and play with and share with others. Could be very useful, so you can access that on My Community. And there's a whole suite of other related resources around community assets in general and the management and ownership of land and buildings on My Community, which we'd recommend you have a look at. It's worth noting as well for those with a particular need for translation into Welsh that is offered for core material. Our partners in Wales are also able to work in a one-to-one basis for those that are prioritised for in-depth support in Welsh as well. Next slide, please. And probably I think it's worth mentioning about how more broadly parish councils can assist community organisations as well as be direct beneficiaries and applicants to the fund. Obviously, many assets, many valuable community assets are in the ownership of parish councils, and the potential transfer of those to other organisations may be an objective which could be relevant and could be really supportive as part of a proposition. So you're providing a kind of community leadership role is obviously really helpful in terms of collaboration and partnership working, and these are the kinds of aspects which are looked at in the fund and are part of the marking scheme, and that kind of engagement and support role could be really essential, and as a source of match funding as well. So parish councils, again, if they're not direct applicants, may well be supportive of an application that's being led by another community organisation on their patch, and match funding through precept or public works boards or loan or whatever could well be a essential part of the funding cocktail that could make an application successful. I think that's the final slide. Yeah, so next steps, check out the resources that are available and they're growing all the time, and be hopefully relevant to your particular application or to anybody else in your network at a local level. Access those, check out the webinars around some of the topics already, or get in touch through the inquiry form on My Community about any aspects around the fund. Thank you.
Fantastic. And thank you, Stephen. Thank you both for such a comprehensive overview of the fund and the support that's available. So colleagues on the line, if you haven't had a chance to put your questions forward yet, please use the Q&A. It's full of questions in there that you've already been up voting so far. And I'll turn to those. There's a question I know that's caught James's eye. So I'll start with that and then I'll work my way through the questions. We'll endeavour to get through as many as we possibly can. There may well be the case that James and Stephen need to take them away and we can provide some further information following today. But quite an interesting question that's here, perhaps one for James and Stephen. What happens if you have a community, a parish or a town council and another group in their area that want to bid for the same asset? James, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, I think it's really important because that might be something that happens more often now that councils can apply as well. And from our perspective, that's what I meant about the kind of community engagement and support for the project element being really key in our assessment. So we would be looking for broad support coming in behind the project, which would mean that various groups in your area had kind of coalesced around a single project. So if there are people with different ideas about how an asset should be saved or how it would actually like to put in competing bids or competing projects, we won't consider competing bids for the same asset. You'd need to go through a process of community kind of engagement and consultation and come to an agreement amongst the community around how that asset should be used in future, and then put a bid in on that basis with whichever lead organisation is most appropriate.
Thanks, James. I'm guessing, Stephen, anything you want to add?
No, that sounds very sensible. Clearly, coordination and communication's key, isn't it, at the heart of that? And people speaking to each other would definitely be recommended.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so I'll work my way down through the questions that everyone's posed, and do keep putting them in and upvoting the other questions that you were thinking of posting yourself, but other colleagues have already done that already. So in an instance where we're an unincorporated charity, but the sole trustee is the town council, can we apply? I'll start with James, or either of you want to kick off with that one?
I think, and we might get a few of these, that some of this is new and we need to test it. So we'll come back to you and we'll make sure that's done in writing. Yeah, we'll come back to you on that. Yeah.
And sorry, go on, Stephen.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there is unincorporated would be obviously another key thing, because to draw down the grant, you would need to be an incorporated organisation at that point anyway. So there's a bit of a fundamental principle there, which may get in the way of the project, even if the other thing was checked out.
Cool. Okay. I think here's a colleague that's already ahead of the game. So having sent an expression of interest 4 weeks ago, is the department managing its 3-week turnaround for reviewing those expressions of interest and indicating whether a full application can be made? I think that's one for you, James.
Yes, so we are averaging the 3-week turnaround, but clearly we haven't managed it for you. If you could email coff@levellingup.gov.uk kind of right now and flag in the subject line that you've been on this webinar, I'll have a look into it for you. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, James. And I think that probably applies for any other colleagues as well that are outside of that, the ambition of that 3-week turnaround. Do email into colleagues on the email that James has said. Okay, so we own the building, but it is run currently by a community interest organisation. Can we apply to have the building renovated or changed?
So what the prospectus says about this is that the organisation that applies for the funding should be the organisation that runs the project, meaning the organisation in this case that runs the renovation or the change. So whichever the CIO or the parish council, whoever is going to lead on the renovation, or if it was a purchase, lead on the purchase, they're the organisation that should apply. On the wider point around the type of project, if the renovation is needed to save the building, or the building's at risk for some reason, then yes, that would be eligible. What's just really key is that whoever puts the application together and is the lead for the project, if you like, is also going to be the lead for the actual project works when they take place.
Great, thanks, James. And always one of the most popular questions, I'm sure, in any event that society and NALC holds. Can we see the slides afterwards? And I'll repeat what Abby and I said both at the start. The slides from James and Stephen will both be shared in the show notes that will go out afterwards. Here's a really good one, actually. So how many times can you apply? If you have 2 buildings, is it possible to have 2 bites of the cherry?
Stephen, go on. Stephen's
I think you to give you the official view of that. Certainly not around the same project. No.
Yeah, I agree. If you've got 2 completely different buildings that could both exist, kind of thing, they're doing something different, or there's a reason for them both being there, then that's 2 different applications. The fact that you're the same applicant is fine. Was there a first bit of the question? Was there another bit of it, Justin?
It was how many times can you apply, and if you've got 2 buildings, can you have 2 bites of the cherry?
Yeah, so essentially you can if the buildings have a different purpose, yeah. And on a related note, if you are unsuccessful and you want to reapply, you can do that, and there isn't a limit on the number of times you can do that, but we might tell you at some point that this project's never going to be eligible or something like that. So we might kind of say no more applications, please. But in principle, you can keep applying.
Yep. This might be an easy one. Can we, the community, the parish or the town council, buy land that would otherwise be at risk?
Yeah, purchase of land is an acceptable asset for the purposes of the fund.
Okay. And so I think we've already covered that. How long after submitting an expression of interest does one get a response or feedback? I think, James, that was the aim there is at 3 weeks.
Yeah, the aim is at 3 weeks. We are, yeah, as I say, we are turning them around on average in 3 weeks, but flag if you've been waiting longer.
Yeah, cool. And James, one of the, I think the points you made, you stressed that the asset should be at risk or loss. Would a bid simply to enhance, say, community amenity be considered?
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be. No, so it needs to be at risk of loss or already lost. And we're talking about kind of because it's become derelict, because the building fabric is no longer suitable, or because you can't run a kind of sustainable business from the building with its current facilities, and you need to improve those in order to continue running the business, for example. There's different sort of reasons why it might be at loss, but essentially you need to be able to say to us that without the community ownership fund money coming in, we're looking at closing the doors, or we wouldn't be able to reopen the doors.
Yeah, I see Stephen nodded there. A longish one here that I'll read out. So not all community assets generate an income. Public toilets is an example of which many community parish and town councils now run or have taken over, particularly in recent years. But they have a significant community support for their provision. So can the community ownership fund the renovation so the building can stay open if the council commits to the revenue costs of running that asset?
Yes, yeah, we haven't had any of these yet, as you can imagine, this type of project. But I think that's the kind of thing we'll see a bit more with town, parish, and community councils. Is essentially you've got a better, maybe a better chance of having other revenue income sources, and you could use that to fund assets that would otherwise not work. But we can cover the capital and kind of get them up to a really good spec so that you can do that in the future.
Cool. Excellent question here on match funding. Does section 106 funding, that developer levy, count as match funding?
I believe it does. How it could be demonstrated in a particular case, I think, is probably the challenge, as sometimes seen as a little bit opaque and vague, and obviously involves a lot of other stakeholders with their interests. But in principle, I'm sure the department would welcome SIL as a match option. But I think clarity about how you're going to obtain it and at what point you're going to obtain it, I think it would be the real sticking point.
Yeah, I see, James, you're nodding your head at that one. Similar vein, actually, here on match funding. Can the match funding come from the Public Works loan board loan that a community parish or town council might take out?
Yes, yes.
Okay. would a building listed as an asset of community value be prohibited from applying to the fund, or would the listing enhance the application?
Not prohibited at all, and could well enhance an application. Certainly demonstrates in a very tangible way community value, community interest. You would assume some sort of engagement would have already happened to get it to that point. So it could well strengthen an application, but certainly eligible.
And a question along the same lines as I think the point around working closely with the community and other community organisations. A colleague here said they started an application before on behalf of a charity, but this is a joint project also with the parish council. Would it be better to send on behalf of the charity or the parish council?
Related back to my earlier comment, if there is a lead organisation of any kind, and I guess there will be ultimately, because someone's going to receive the funding into their bank account, will only be paying one organisation in the first instance, then I recommend that they should be the ones who put the application in. If you're arguing that actually you're completely equal joint partners, then you just need to nominate a lead partner to put the application in and be the named person and to fill all of that in and be consistent with that when you put the application in. What we're really looking for is clarity around who's going to get the money, who do we have a legal relationship with, who are we going to hold accountable. So decide who that's going to be and stick with it throughout the application.
Yep. And another question on eligibility actually, are churches able to apply to the fund?
Yep.
Simple one there, that's a yes. Okay, so if a building is a benefit to the community but it's beyond saving and repairs, can funding be sought to build a new building in its place as a replacement? Yeah,
we have, this is where things can get quite tricky in terms of what's the asset and how can you move it and that kind of thing. But yes, essentially you can, there's a line in the prospectus about moving an asset to a new, more suitable location, which could include either finding another building that you're going to take over and essentially put the asset in, or building a new building from scratch in which to hold the asset that's been lost. That's absolutely fine. The new location doesn't itself have to be a community asset. The asset is the thing that you're saving that's beyond repair, that's been lost, and you're moving it to a new location. So yes, essentially that's eligible.
And a colleague I think is quite interested in, I think Stephen, you mentioned some of the upcoming webinars you've got. There's a heritage asset webinar tomorrow. They're saying how can they book onto that?
Via my community website, mycommunity.org.uk is the place where you can register for that webinar and any others that are coming, and listen to past ones.
Yeah, cool. And can you just repeat that website at the end, just so colleagues have got that clearly, because I'm sure they might want to just pump that straight into their browsers straight away.
Yeah, it's mycommunity.org.uk.
mycommunity.org.uk. Okay. Similar to, I think, similar to previous questions, a bit similarity to some of these. We've got a local churchyard that the parish council has taken responsibility for, including renovations and repairs, but it doesn't own it. Would that be in scope of the fund?
Yeah, so the fund is for supporting community ownership. So the funding will need to kind of go to the community owner of the asset. So it sounds like that would be the church in this case. The exception to that would be if the parish council, when you say they've taken responsibilities for it, if they've taken a lease on the area, then we could fund, you need at least 15 years lease of the asset. Otherwise, it sounds like the church should be applying, maybe with the parish council supporting. The key thing, again, is kind of about where our responsibilities lie, who we're funding, where the money's going, and that needs to be the organisation that has long-term ownership of the asset.
Okay, and specifically thinking about community pubs, and this might touch on I think some of the support that you both mentioned, and Stephen in particular, some of your partners. Are there networks that can help with constructing the management case for a community pub project?
Yes, definitely. The support that we and partners are providing would be relevant, and the Plunkett Foundation, for instance, who specialise in rural enterprises, are part of the consortium. So yes, there are specialist providers that could assist on helping organisations make their case.
And of all the kind of types of assets so far that have been in scope of the fund and where that specialist support is, are there any gaps at the moment, or is that all kind of pretty comprehensively covered across the support programme?
There's certainly no gaps that we're aware of at the moment. There's been some initial spikes here and there around particular types, but they were more where projects were already motoring and ready to go. We've seen, yeah, a whole range, and specialisms can be provided around, yeah, sport, land, heritage, and so on. So we'd be interested to know if there's anything that isn't covered, actually.
Yeah.
We'd really like to see some more green spaces, some more parks, playgrounds, that kind of thing. Previously, not had too many of those, and also, as I mentioned, some of those unique assets that might not come under funding streams from other government funds because they're kind of quite a one-off, maybe in your area, something quite unique. We've had applications for all sorts in the past, so yeah.
Okay. Here's another good one, actually. If a community interest company has already applied to the fund for one of the council's assets it manages, would that preclude the council applying for further funding for other assets?
It sounds like, I assume we mean a parish council.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a group has made an application on a parish council's asset in the past, and now the parish council is looking to be an applicant. How those two relate, which I think is an interesting exploration, which I'm sure we should need to be really clear about in the subsequent application. But in principle, they're coming from two different lead bodies, so would be okay. That's how I read it.
And there's a couple of questions on links to neighbourhood planning, which is quite interesting to see. Is more weight given to applications where the asset is noted as being of community importance within the neighbourhood plan?
For James to say there's no weight, that I believe, or there's no explicit scoring around that I'm aware of, but clearly that's a good strategic argument to make, and I would have thought would be taken into account in terms of making a strong proposition.
Yeah, exactly. Like asset of community value might help you demonstrate previous work done and recognition of the assets, not something that has a fixed score or weighting applied to it, but can be helpful.
There are quite a number of different types of assets and kind of parts of the now the community parish and town council world and other community bodies that are covered by the fund. Is there any sector prioritization?
No, there isn't. There's no kind of prioritization when we assess bids, and we're encouraging, as I've said, kind of all a great diversity of bids is what we'd like to see. When final decisions are made on which bids will be funded, the Secretary of State for the department can make decisions if they choose to not to fund every kind of bid that meets the minimum threshold. They can choose to prioritise bids by 5 criteria which are published online. So they can choose things like geographical area and say we're lacking bids in the northwest, so I'm going to have more bids in the northwest. What's actually happened to date is that the Secretary of State has funded every bid that met the minimum score criteria, and with a fair amount of money left, that may well continue, but he has the ability to make that prioritisation.
And there's no sector prioritisation for the in-depth help either, or the in-depth support. I think any project which is potentially eligible, and we get the EOI list directly from the department, is potentially able to then be assessed for support, but there's no sector kind of prioritisation around that front. It's all based on location and area of disadvantage being the priority measure.
Yeah. A couple of questions here linked to assets which may well be in the ownership of others. So is colleague here saying, am I correct in assuming that the town council cannot apply to purchase a building which is owned by the county council, but which might be at risk?
So it could be an eligible project, but you can't transfer capital funds to the higher tier local authority. They can't credit a capital receipt from the funding. The reasoning being that we don't want COF funding, which is intended for community groups and local councils, to then go up into kind of higher levels of local government or any other government public body. So if you could purchase it with your own funds, or you could have it transferred for a nominal amount, such as £1, and then use the COF funding to renovate or improve it, that would be eligible, but you can't transfer that capital into the higher tier local authority.
Yeah, and James, you mentioned a moment ago those highly valued and much loved local assets, our green spaces, our parks and our playgrounds. Question here on, can the fund be used to equip play areas, but which are going to be provided by new residential development?
It sounds to me like it would be impossible to demonstrate a risk of loss argument on that particular project, unless there'd been a loss of other play equipment or outdoor areas, and this was essentially a replacement as well as being aligned to a new residential area. But it does have to have a link to something lost or something at risk of loss.
I'm sure some of these kinds of questions will already start coming into the Department of Locality. So perhaps with some of the questions from today and those that you come in to, either your guidance will be updated or some FAQs would probably be helpful for colleagues to navigate their way through some of these specifics. Okay, would an asset be eligible if it's in use, but only once, quite a specific one, but only once a week? The income generates only equates to a small amount of about £1,000 a year with £20,000 a year running costs. It's not sustainable to continue on that basis. So is there a way of looking to sustain that asset for community use?
I would say it's similar to James's point just now. It's about demonstrating the real threat of losses. If there is genuine peril related to that scenario, which there possibly could be, then it starts to get into the territory where it could well be eligible.
But it's going to need a sustainable financial plan, whatever that might be. So maybe the COF funding can do something to this asset that makes it generate more income, or the organisation can identify other income sources to help pay for the upkeep. We provide some revenue funding to deal with cash flow work in the first year of the asset operating, because you might take a little while to wind up some business, to start some business operations that will generate later income, but not beyond the first year. So it will need to look after itself in terms of finances after the first year.
Yep, and I'll just take a couple more questions with a conscious of the time. Another one on principal authorities and onward devolution. So our principal council is keen to offload many derelict community buildings. So the community parish town council will get ownership. Would the fund be able to be used to refurb those assets to make them safe?
Yes, that sounds like just the thing. Yep. Okay.
And another one around parks again. Would a community park suffering severe drainage problems and consequential death of trees and residents being unable to use the park, would that qualify for support to improve the park?
Yeah, never had that one, but sounds like it. It's threatening the use of the asset and threatening its use as a community amenity. So yeah.
Yeah. And another one that's still on playgrounds, actually seems to be quite a thread of these. Would the refurbishment of a play park be considered if the present equipment needs to be replaced due to its age?
Yep, definitely. They have a life. It will stop being usable at some point and stop being safe. So yeah.
Cool. I'll take a couple more and We've got a pub that's closed, but the brewery still holds the lease, but the land is owned by the local council. So can we apply to the fund to buy the lease on the building from the brewery? Quite a specific one, I think, that one.
I think we'd need to know what the end game was beyond buying the lease, I think. But let's assume there is an idea to go beyond just the land and to run the enterprise. Then yes, that would potentially be an interesting project.
This is a good moment to plug the EOI again, I think. It's the kind of thing, give us a bit more detail at EOI stage and we'll be able to come back to you.
And I'll end on this one actually, which is on cost. Does the fund only cover capital costs?
So it covers primarily capital costs, but revenue costs of up to 20% of your capital funding, or £50,000, whichever is lower, as I've mentioned, for the first year of operations.
Thanks both. I think we've got through as many questions as we could. I'm sorry to any colleagues who put their questions in that we didn't get through to. We can share these with Stephen and James, and if there are any kind of particular themes that we can share afterwards, we'll try and do that. And I'll thank you from me to you both, and look forward to continuing to work with you to promote and support the take up in the parish, community and town council sector of the fund. I'll hand back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, James. Thanks, Steve. And Abby, thanks for your administration. This came into being only a couple of weeks ago, and I really appreciate you all joining us at such short notice, but you gents for prepping and coming along. I'm really sad we didn't get to the question of the fish at Didcot in the lake, so I hope our colleague at Didcot gets a response on that. But look, I just wanted to say to the delegates, it seems to me, I wondered how this morning was going to go. I didn't know too much about the cost. What I do know now is both Stephen and James have been saying yes way more than they were saying no. This money is there, it's not spent. The Secretary of State hasn't had to step in. We're really anxious that we just want to spend all this money on good work and projects that are valuable to communities, and we want our sector to kind of step up and play their part. I know this can be tedious and it requires perseverance, but really would urge and exhort you to work through this. The guys have been supportive here. They don't want to say no, they want to say yes, and they want to help you get this money unlocked. So do please draw on all these fantastic resources. We're just looking at the community website. It's all good stuff, and we want to get this money out into the communities where it should be. So please do put the work in. Look for us for support, and there's more coming in terms of the slides and all the rest of it. So thanks once again to everybody for coming. Thanks for joining us, James, Steve, Justin, of course, and Abby, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.